The first signs of the silent invasion did not arrive in fire or thunder, but in absences, little erasures that no one noticed at first. A missing hour in the morning routine, a familiar streetlight that was suddenly gone as though it had never stood. Neighbors waving with smiles that seemed correct but carried the wrong names in the wrong mouths. And though the world spun on its axis without interruption, those attuned to patterns felt a tremor inside the continuity of life itself, the sense that history was already being edited even as they lived it. And when entire weeks began vanishing from calendars with governments and civilians alike, unable to agree on what year it was or which, wars had truly ended. The understanding dawned that the enemy had no need for armies, because their weapons were memories themselves, the scaffolding of reality bending like clay in their unseen hands. Entire battalions awoke inside bases that had been stripped of insignias, their commanders missing from the records, their orders replaced with directives they swore were false but could not disprove. And when they tried to recall the faces of loved ones waiting beyond the fences, their minds bled with static, a veil of forgetfulness smothering names and birthdays and anniversaries until even grief was denied them. And though they rallied, swearing to hold the line against this invisible infiltration, the harder they fought to retain themselves, the more fragmented they became. Soldiers staring at each other with recognition that never quite aligned, as if every interaction was staged, every bond rehearsed by actors who had been given only half the script. And in that halfness lay the strategy of the invaders for what could rebellion mean. If the rebels no longer remembered why rebellion mattered, the civilians fared no better, their neighborhoods morphing slowly yet unstoppably, houses rearranging themselves between twilights, entire blocks vanishing into fields of grass where children once played. And when those children were mentioned by name, their parents tilted their heads with polite confusion, insisting no such lives had ever been born. And as fear grew, so did compliance, because the human mind cannot fight what it cannot prove. Bauer swallowed the survivors who whispered about Erasure were branded unstable, hysterical, clinging to illusions in a world that was still the same. Though in truth the same world had been gone for years, consumed piece by piece, until humanity's denial was the greatest victory of the silent invasion. For they had taught people to mistrust themselves, and that mistrust was the chain that bound them. Underground enclaves sprang up in the ruins of subway tunnels, survivors who etched their memories into walls with nails and knives, desperate to retain even fragments of truth before the next wave came to scour them clean. And there, in the dripping dark, they held councils where names were recited like prayers, though each night the roll call grew shorter, names evaporating into silence as though they had never belonged to anyone. And when someone stood to protest, insisting they had a child, a wife, a brother whose name had vanished, the others watched in horror as their own recollections collapsed in real time, unable to summon even the image of the protesters' claimed loved one. And in that shared erasure lay the invaders' cruelty, for they did not conquer with violence, but by erasing connections. until every human heart became an island, isolated and pliable, ready to surrender, not because of fear, but because of emptiness. The first who dared call themselves resistance learned quickly that weapons were useless, for the silent invasion did not bleed, did not burn, did not stumble, because they had no form that could be pierced existing. Instead, as an echo, a rewriting that slithered through thought. And though the resistance scrawled maps of vanishing districts and catalogued memories in desperate archives, they found that even their records betrayed them, words shifting on paper, ink smearing into new shapes that testified to false histories. And soon even their archives became traps, luring them deeper into confusion. For if reality itself conspired with the invaders, what refuge could there be? And so the bravest among them began carving scars into their skin, physical notations that memory could not delete, desperate glyphs of resistance etched in blood and fire. Yet even those scars sometimes healed overnight, as though the body had forgotten it was ever wounded. It was then that the survivors realized the silent invasion was not an attack from outside, but a reprogramming from within. Something seeded in their perception, an infection of time and continuity. And though theories spread like wildfire that the invaders had been here since the dawn of thought, that they had guided evolution itself, that the human race was nothing more than a container for memories they could harvest and erase. At wealth, the most chilling theory was the simplest, that the invasion was not new at all, but eternal. And every age, every culture, every civilization humanity had ever known was merely a temporary configuration permitted by the invaders before being rewritten again. And perhaps even the act of rebellion itself was a memory implanted to test the limits of their control, a cruel experiment in the futility of freedom. In those nights, the survivors did not sleep, for dreams had become infiltrated as well, filled with faceless figures who whispered with voices of the erased, promising release if only the dreamer surrendered willingly. And many awoke screaming, only to find their screams unheard, their companions staring blankly as though no sound had been made. And those who endured realized that the invaders fed upon acknowledgement itself, that to name them, to resist them, was to give them purchase. Yet silence, too, was no defense, for silence was their native element, and so humanity was trapped between two impossibilities, doomed whether they fought or yielded, and within that doom the invaders thrived, reshaping the earth into a stage for a play whose script no human would ever read. The military remnants tried to wage campaigns, launching assaults on coordinates where erasures seemed thickest. But their satellites betrayed them, showing fields where cities had once been, oceans where deserts had stretched for centuries. And when they bombarded these voids, they discovered only their own bases obliterated, their own supply lines severed, as if the invasion had reached into their targeting systems and persuaded them to annihilate themselves. And though they swore to regroup, to rebuild, they found their own hierarchies dissolving, generals forgetting their ranks, privates waking as captains with no memory of how they had risen, entire chains of command collapsing into absurdity. until the armies themselves became nothing but wandering mobs, carrying weapons whose purpose they no longer understood. And in their collapse, the silent invasion tightened its grip, remaking humanity, not as prisoners, but as actors, reciting lines they did not believe in, plays they could not comprehend. It was in this chaos that whispers of safe zones spread bastions, where memories endured unbroken. Bend desperate multitudes marched toward these rumors, only to find empty plains, barren stretches of stone, where nothing had ever stood. And, though they wept begging for some proof that they had not been chasing illusions, the invaders left only silence, a silence deeper than despair. And in that silence entire caravans dissolved, families forgetting each other even as they clung together, until only individuals remained, staring blankly at horizons that no longer promised escape. Bow, and perhaps that was the final cruelty of the silent invasion, that even hope was a tool they wielded with precision, baiting humanity into exhausting itself against mirages before delivering the coup de grace of forgetfulness. By the time cities themselves vanished, replaced overnight with empty landscapes where skyscrapers became skeletons of rock and asphalt melted into rivers of sand, the survivors had no strength left to scream for screaming, required certainty, and certainty was the first thing the invaders had stolen. Bound, and though elders whispered that they remembered other worlds, other histories, these whispers were shunned, for belief in memory was itself a liability, a temptation that might draw the invaders closer. And so humanity reduced itself to rituals, muttering strings of numbers, inventing languages that shifted daily, anything to outpace the erasures. But the invaders were always faster, always deeper, and soon even the rituals collapsed, leaving only the hollow rhythm of survival without context, existence stripped of meaning until existence itself became indistinguishable from death. In one of the final enclaves, hidden beneath mountains that once bore names no one remembered, a recorder was discovered, an old machine with gears that resisted rewriting. And into this machine the last chroniclers poured their confessions, begging any future listener to believe that they had lived, that they had loved, that humanity had been real once. And though the recordings filled dozens of reels, when they were played back, the voices were gone, place by silence, punctuated with faint static. And it was then the chroniclers understood that even the act of remembering had been permitted only temporarily, that the invaders had allowed them this illusion of defiance only to savor the moment of its collapse. And when the chroniclers vanished, the recorder remained, its reels spinning endlessly with nothing, a monument not to survival but to deletion. Still, there are stories told in hushed tones that the silent invasion left a single flaw, a crack in the machinery of erasure, and within that crack one soldier remembered everything, every vanished face, every erased city, every forgotten battle. And though he wandered alone, hunted by shadows that clawed at his mind, he etched his memories into stone cliffs with hands torn to bone, carving until his blood became mortar. And when, at last, his body failed, the cliffs stood covered in names no one recognized. monuments to lives denied, and perhaps those cliffs endure still, untouched by rewriting. Perhaps not, but even the possibility of their existence is itself a rebellion, a defiance carved against the tide of silence, though whether anyone will ever find them is uncertain. And perhaps the uncertainty itself is what the invaders intended. In the end, the silent invasion required no conclusion, no final battle or decisive act, because conquest was achieved not in fire, but in erasure. And when the last remnants of humanity surrendered their doubts and accepted the reality presented before them, there was no moment of surrender, no signature, no collapse, only the quiet continuation of life inside a narrative not their own. And maybe that was the most horrifying victory of all that humanity could be conquered without ever realizing it, convinced they had chosen their fate when, in truth, their choices had been erased long before they were made. And so the world rolled on, silent, conquered, and oblivious. A theater of ghosts, performing lines written by unseen hands.